Welcome back to Warm Pages, where we warm hearts with stories as comforting as your morning coffee. I'm your host Harry, and today we're steeping ourselves in the world of Sherlock Holmes. Now tell me, isn't it wonderful how stories bring us together, no matter where we are in this big world? Before we begin, I'd love to know which corner of the world are you enjoying this story from today. I'm reading every single one. Let's get started. Chapter 1. The Impossible Disappearance. It was in the late autumn of 1895, when the last crimson leaves clung desperately to the trees of London, and a perpetual fog had settled upon the city like a morning veil. The weather had turned unseasonably bitter, with a penetrating dampness that seemed to seep through the thickest of coats and into one's very bones. Such meteorological melancholy had confined my friend Sherlock Holmes to our quarters at 221B Baker Street for nearly a fortnight, where he had fallen into one of his customary states of listlessness that inevitably followed the conclusion of a stimulating case. On this particular morning, I had descended to breakfast to find Holmes already seated at the table, his tall, lean figure wrapped in his mouse-colored dressing gown, his hawkish features illuminated by the wavering gaslight as he perused the morning papers with evident distaste. "Nothing, Watson," he declared, casting aside the Times with a gesture of profound disappointment. "Nothing but the most commonplace of crimes committed by the most unimaginative of criminals. One might as well study the habits of the common housefly for all the intellectual stimulation this dreary world currently offers." I was about to offer some platitude regarding the blessing of peace when our conversation was interrupted by the urgent peal of the doorbell, followed by hurried footsteps upon the stair. "Ah!" exclaimed Holmes, his grey eyes suddenly kindling with interest. "Perhaps the fates have heard my lamentations. That is the step of a man who brings news of importance, Watson." Note the rapidity and urgency of his assent. Before I could respond, Mrs. Hudson announced our visitor, a gentleman who introduced himself as Mr. James Harrington, Assistant Director of Operations for the Great Western Railway. He entered our sitting room with such evident agitation that I instinctively offered him a brandy, which he accepted with trembling hands. Mr. Harrington was a man of some 50 years, with the meticulous appearance of one accustomed to precision in all things. His clothes were of fine quality, but showed signs of having been worn continuously for an unusual length of time. His face, naturally florid, now bore the pallor of one who has suffered a profound shock, and his eyes darted nervously about the room as though seeking reassurance from the mundane familiarity of our humble furnishings. "Mr. Holmes," he began, his voice scarcely above a whisper, "I come to you with a matter so extraordinary, so utterly impossible, that I fear for my professional reputation in the mere telling of it." Holmes leaned forward, steepling his long, thin fingers beneath his chin. "Pray continue, Mr. Harrington. I find that the impossible often proves merely to be the improbable viewed through the lens of conventional thinking." Our visitor drew a deep breath and proceeded to relate a tale so extraordinary that had it come from a man of less obvious respectability, I should have dismissed it as the ravings of a disordered mind. "Yesterday morning," said Harrington, "the 8:15 express train from Paddington to Bristol departed on schedule. It carried 47 passengers and a crew of 5, the engineer, his assistant, the guard, and 2 attendants. The train was observed leaving London in perfect order, and telegraph messages confirm it passed through the first 3 scheduled points along its route." He paused, drawing a handkerchief across his brow despite the chill in the room. "And then, Mr. Holmes, the train simply, it entered a 10-mile stretch of uninterrupted track where no stations exist, and it never emerged. It has, to all appearances, disappeared from the face of the earth." "Surely there must be some explanation," I interjected. "A derailment, perhaps, or—" "Dr. Watson, we have examined every inch of those 10 miles. 3 separate search parties have combed the area. There is no wreckage, no disturbed terrain, no sign whatsoever that the train ever passed through." Yet the telegraph operators at both ends of the stretch are adamant. The train entered, but it never came out. Holmes's eyes gleamed with interest. Most intriguing. Tell me, Mr. Harrington, was there anything of particular note about this train or its passengers? Our visitor hesitated momentarily. The matter is of some delicacy, Mr. Holmes, but I am authorized to speak plainly. Among the passengers was Lord Edmund Blackwood, a senior official in the Foreign Office. He was carrying diplomatic documents of considerable sensitivity. I see, said Holmes softly. And Scotland Yard's theory? Inspector Lestrade suspects sabotage related to these documents, but even he cannot explain how an entire train could vanish without trace. There were no side tracks, no branches, nowhere for it to go. It is as though it simply ceased to exist. Holmes rose abruptly and crossed to the window, where he stood for some moments gazing out at the fog-shrouded street below. When he turned back to us, there was a light in his eyes that I knew well. The thrill of the chase had awakened his dormant faculties. Mr. Harrington, I shall take your case. It presents features of singular interest. Pray leave your card and return to your offices. Make it known that Sherlock Holmes is investigating the matter, and ensure that nothing is disturbed along that stretch of track. After our visitor had departed, Holmes remained standing by the fire, his pipe sending up languid spirals of blue smoke as he contemplated this extraordinary puzzle. What do you make of it, Holmes? I ventured at last. A train cannot vanish into thin air, Watson. Therefore, it must have gone somewhere. The question is not whether an explanation exists, but rather which of several explanations is the correct one. His voice dropped to a murmur. And why Lord Blackwood was on that particular train, carrying documents of such importance that they could not be entrusted to a diplomatic courier. He suddenly sprang into action, discarding his dressing gown. Come, Watson. The game is afoot. We must be at Paddington within the hour. I shall telegraph Lestrade to meet us there. His eyes gleamed with anticipation. A vanishing train, Watson. 47 souls disappeared without trace. One could scarcely conceive of a more stimulating problem to dispel the November gloom. As I hastened to prepare myself for our journey, I could not suppress a shudder that was not entirely due to the chill of that fog-bound morning. For I had glimpsed something in Holmes's expression that suggested this was no ordinary case, even by his extraordinary standards. Something in the disappearance of the 8:15 to Bristol had struck a chord of recognition in that remarkable mind, a chord that resonated with danger. Chapter 2. The Empty Track. The morning grew increasingly forbidding as our train departed from Paddington Station. A chill mist had descended upon London, transforming the familiar cityscape into a phantasmagoria of indistinct shapes, looming and receding as we passed. Holmes sat opposite me, his keen eyes scanning the morning papers, which now featured sensational accounts of the mysterious disappearance. The press has wasted no time, Watson, he remarked dryly. Already they speak of supernatural agencies and diabolical plots. How mankind loves to embrace the fantastical when confronted with the unfamiliar. We were met at the small rural station of Thornbridge by Inspector Lestrade, whose ferret-like features bore an expression of unusual gravity. A brisk wind had risen, carrying with it the scent of damp earth and decaying vegetation. Dark clouds scudded across the sky, threatening rain that would further complicate our investigation. "I'm grateful you've come, Mr. Holmes," said Lestrade as we climbed into the waiting police carriage. "This business has the Yard utterly confounded." "Enlighten me as to your findings thus far," Holmes replied, settling himself against the worn leather upholstery. "Precious little to report, I'm afraid. We've examined every inch of the track where the train was last seen. No signs of derailment, no indication of any disturbance whatsoever. The carriage lurched forward, carrying us along a rutted country lane bordered by ancient hedgerows. The landscape was desolate, a patchwork of fallow fields stretching away to distant woodlands shrouded in mist. "Tell me about the signalmen," Holmes said. "I understand there are telegraph stations at either end of this mysterious stretch. Indeed, That's where the accounts become contradictory. The morning signalman, James Perkins, swears the 8:15 passed his position at exactly 9:47. The afternoon man, William Tanner, is equally adamant that it never emerged at the other end. Most curious, murmured Holmes. And the telegraph wires themselves, intact, though there appears to have been some recent repair work. Nothing unusual in that. The company maintains them regularly. Our carriage eventually came to a halt beside the railway line, at the precise spot where the train had reportedly entered the fateful stretch. The scene was eerily quiet, save for the mournful keening of the wind through the telegraph wires overhead. The rails stretched away before us, two parallel lines of steel disappearing into the distance, where the track curved gently around a low hill. Holmes immediately set to work, his tall figure bent almost double as he examined the rails with his pocket magnifying glass. Lestrade and I followed at a respectful distance, watching as he moved methodically along the track, occasionally pausing to collect some invisible specimen or to make a notation in his pocketbook. "Do you observe anything unusual about this section of track, Watson?" he inquired without looking up from his examination. I confessed that I did not. "Look at the wear pattern on the inside edge of the rail. Compare it to that further back." He indicated the areas in question. "This section shows signs of unusual stress, as though subjected to a weight far greater than that of an ordinary train." As he spoke, a fine drizzle began to fall, speckling the dark surface of his ulster coat. The surrounding countryside seemed to withdraw further into the mist, isolating us in a world of steel and gravel, and the pervasive smell of damp creosote from the railway sleepers. "And here," Holmes continued, pointing to a small area of discoloration on the rail, "observe this metallic residue, quite unlike the normal oxidation one would expect." He scraped a small sample into a glass vial, which disappeared into his pocket. Rising to his full height, he surveyed the scene with narrowed eyes. "I should like to speak with the signalmen," he announced, "and then to any local residents who might have observed the train's passage, or lack thereof." The afternoon proved to be a study in contradictions. James Perkins, the morning signalman, was a veteran railway man of some 30 years' experience. His small signal box, perched above the track, and filled with the rhythmic clicking of telegraph instruments, was meticulously organized, reflecting its occupant's methodical nature. "I saw the train pass with my own eyes, sir," he insisted, his weathered face earnest beneath its crown of silver hair. "The 8:15 express, right on time it was. I logged it in my register here." He tapped a leather-bound volume on his desk and telegraphed ahead to Tanner, as is procedure. "And did you receive acknowledgement?" "Aye, that I did, though," he hesitated. "Pray continue," Holmes encouraged. "Well, sir, there was a slight delay before Tanner's acknowledgement came through. Only a minute or so, but it struck me as unusual. Tanner's typically prompt, you see." William Tanner, the afternoon signalman, was equally adamant in his testimony. A younger man than Perkins, with a military bearing that spoke of recent service, he maintained that the train had never arrived at his position. "I would have seen it, Mr. Holmes. My signal box commands a view of nearly 2 miles of track in either direction. Nothing passed that day, nothing at all." "Yet you acknowledged Perkins' telegraph?" A flicker of uncertainty crossed Tanner's face. "I did, sir, though I admit the message seemed irregular somehow. I assumed it was atmospheric interference affecting the line." As we departed Tanner's signal box, the rain had intensified, drumming against our umbrellas and transforming the ballast between the railway sleepers into a series of shallow puddles that reflected the leaden sky. "What do you make of these contradictory accounts?" I asked Holmes as we trudged along the path beside the track. "They are both telling the truth as they perceive it, Watson. The question is, what actually occurred?" Our next interview was with Jeremiah Hobbs, a farmer whose lands adjoined the railway line approximately midway along the missing train's route. Hobbs's cottage was a study in rural simplicity, the low-ceilinged rooms warmed by a peat fire that failed to entirely dispel the damp chill of the day. I heard the train right enough," the old man confirmed, his gnarled hands cradling a mug of strong tea. Heard the whistle clear as day. I did, but then something queer happened. Queer in what way? Holmes inquired, leaning forward intently. Well, sir, normally you hear the clackety-clack of the wheels on the track for a good while after the whistle. But that day there was nothing, just silence, like the train had been swallowed up by the earth itself. As we prepared to leave, a railway worker approached at a run, his uniform sodden with rain, his face a mask of excitement. Inspector Lestrade, we found someone, one of the missing passengers. Where? Lestrade demanded. In a field, sir, nearly 20 miles from here. A farm labourer found him this morning. Unconscious he was, and half dead from exposure. Holmes's eyes gleamed with sudden intensity. Is he able to speak? No, sir. The doctor says he's suffering from shock. But there's something else. The worker lowered his voice. He was found nearly 20 miles from the nearest point of the track, with no sign of how he got there. As we hastened toward our waiting carriage, Holmes paused suddenly, his attention caught by something at the trackside. Stooping swiftly, he retrieved a small fragment of fabric caught on a thorny bush. What have you there, Holmes? I inquired. He examined the scrap carefully, then passed it to me with a significant look. It was a piece of expensive cloth, woven with an unusual herringbone pattern in shades of dark green and black. If I am not mistaken, Watson, this is a fragment from a suit of Lord Edmund Blackwood's distinctive design. He is known for commissioning his tailoring from a particular establishment in Savile Row, where this precise pattern is registered exclusively to him. As we climbed into the carriage, the heavens opened in earnest, sheets of rain obscuring the landscape beyond the windows. Holmes sat in thoughtful silence, his fingers steepled beneath his chin, his eyes distant. We have a signalman who saw a train that seemingly disappeared, he murmured, almost to himself. A farmer who heard it fall silent mid-journey. Telegraph wires recently repaired. Unusual wear on the tracks. A single passenger found miles from where he should be. And now, a fragment of Lord Blackwood's distinctive attire. He turned to me, his eyes suddenly sharp with purpose. The pieces begin to form a pattern, Watson, though its outline remains indistinct. What is our next move? I inquired. To the hospital, he replied decisively. I must speak with this survivor, this banker who has returned from the void, for in his confused recollections may lie the key to unraveling this most singular of mysteries. As our carriage rattled through the deepening gloom, I could not suppress a shiver of apprehension, for whatever force was capable of making an entire train vanish into thin air was surely possessed of power beyond ordinary reckoning, and perhaps beyond ordinary means of detection, even for one as gifted as Sherlock Holmes. Chapter 3. The Man Who Remembered Nothing. The Thornbridge Cottage Hospital was a modest establishment of red brick and whitewashed corridors that carried the pervasive scent of carbolic. Outside, the rain continued its relentless assault, drumming against the windows and transforming the hospital grounds into a quagmire of mud and sodden grass. A solitary gaslight flickered in the gathering dusk, as we were led through the hushed corridors by a nurse whose starched uniform rustled with each precise step. The patient is in a most delicate condition, gentlemen, she informed us in hushed tones. Dr. Merriman has administered a sedative, but he may be lucid enough for brief questioning. The small private room at the end of the corridor was dimly lit by a shaded lamp, casting long shadows across the pale features of the man who lay upon the narrow bed. Charles Fenwick, according to the chart at the foot of his bed, was a man of perhaps 45 years, with the well-tended hands and complexion of one accustomed to indoor pursuits. His breathing was shallow, his eyelids fluttering occasionally, as though in response to some troubling dream. "Mr. Fenwick," Holmes said gently, seating himself beside the bed. "Can you hear me?" The man's eyes opened slowly, revealing pupils dilated by medication or shock. His gaze wandered the ceiling for a moment before focusing, with evident effort, on Holmes' face. "Hugh," his voice was a parched whisper. "My name is Sherlock Holmes. This is my colleague, Dr. Watson, and Inspector Lestrade of Scotland Yard." We wish to ask you about the train, the 8:15 express from Paddington. A tremor passed through Fenwick's frame.
The train?
He murmured. Yes, I remember boarding at Paddington, my customary seat by the window. I was reading the Financial Times. And then, his brow furrowed in concentration.
Nothing.
Nothing until I awoke in that field. With the rain on my face and a terrible pain in my hands, he raised his hands weakly, and I observed what Holmes had already noted, peculiar circular burns perfectly formed on both palms. Holmes produced his magnifying glass and examined these wounds with careful attention. Most unusual, he murmured. These are not ordinary burns, Watson. Observe the precision of the circumference, the uniformity of the damage. I have never seen their like, I admitted. Fenwick's eyes had drifted closed again, but Holmes was not finished. With swift, gentle movements, he examined the man's clothing, which had been neatly folded on a nearby chair. The garments were indeed damp, despite the fact that the rain had only begun some hours after the train's disappearance. More curious still was the condition of Fenwick's pocket watch, a handsome gold timepiece that had stopped precisely at 8:42. The mechanism appears undamaged, Holmes noted, holding the watch to his ear, yet it refuses to resume its function. As he returned the watch to Fenwick's waistcoat, something else caught his attention, a fine, pale sediment caked in the cuffs of the banker's trousers. This too was carefully collected into a glass vial and secreted in Holmes's pocket. Our interview with Fenwick yielded little more of substance. His recollections were fragmentary at best, impressions rather than coherent memories. He recalled a sensation of movement, then stillness, a strange quality of light, voices that seemed to come from a great distance, but nothing that might explain how he had traveled nearly 20 miles from the railway line, nor what had become of his fellow passengers. As we prepared to depart, Dr. Merriman joined us in the corridor, his distinguished features grave beneath a crown of silver hair. I understand this man's testimony may be crucial to your investigation, Mr. Holmes, he said in a low voice, but I must insist that you limit your questioning. His condition is most precarious. What is your diagnosis, doctor? I inquired. Physically, beyond the unusual burns to his hands, he appears to have suffered no serious injury, but his mental state. The doctor hesitated. I have seen similar cases among soldiers returned from the Afghan campaigns, a profound shock to the nervous system that manifests as partial amnesia and a persistent state of anxiety. Holmes nodded thoughtfully. Pray keep us informed of any change in his condition, doctor. Should he remember anything further, it could prove invaluable. We had arranged to meet Lestrade at a small inn nearby, where we might review the day's findings over a late supper. The inspector joined us some 30 minutes after our arrival, shaking the rain from his coat as he entered the snug private parlour we had secured. News from London, Mr. Holmes, he announced without preamble. We've investigated the political enemies Lord Blackwood is known to have made during his tenure at the Foreign Office. All have alibis for the time in question. As I suspected, Holmes replied, pushing aside his barely touched plate. This affair has the hallmark of something far more complex than mere political rivalry, and the diplomatic documents he was carrying. Still missing along with Lord Blackwood himself. Has there been any demand for ransom? Lestrade shook his head. None thus far. It is as though the entire train and everyone aboard it has simply vanished from the face of the earth. Holmes fell silent, staring into the fire that crackled in the small grate. Outside, the wind had risen to a howl, rattling the diamond-paned windows and sending occasional puffs of smoke back down the chimney. There is a pattern here, gentlemen, he said at last. Consider the evidence. A train disappears without trace. A single passenger reappears miles from the track, suffering from exposure despite the absence of rain at the time of his reappearance. His clothing is damp, yet the day was dry until this afternoon. His watch has stopped at a specific time. He bears unusual burns on his hands. And now he reached into his pocket, producing the vial containing the sediment from Fenwick's trousers. "We have this curious substance. What is it?" I asked, peering at the pale, fine-grained material. "I cannot say with certainty without proper analysis, but its appearance suggests a substance not commonly found in the Thornbridge area. I should be most interested to learn if it matches the soil composition where Fenwick was discovered." Our dinner concluded, we retired to our rooms with the agreement to reconvene at first light. I was awakened, however, long before dawn by a sharp rap at my door. Holmes stood in the corridor, fully dressed, his face illuminated by the candle he carried. "Quickly, Watson, there has been a development." As I hurriedly donned my clothing, Holmes explained that word had come from the hospital. An attempt had been made upon Fenwick's life. A man disguised as an orderly had been discovered in the banker's room, administering what would have been a lethal dose of morphine had a vigilant nurse not intervened. The would-be assassin had escaped through a window, leaving behind only a dark woolen cap and a set of footprints rapidly filling with rainwater. By the time we arrived at the hospital, Lestrade was already present, interviewing the shaken nurse while constables searched the surrounding grounds. "No sign of the assailant, I'm afraid," Lestrade reported. "But we have a partial description. A tall man with a pronounced limp and unusually pale eyes." Holmes insisted on seeing Fenwick immediately. The banker was now under police guard, his condition apparently unchanged despite the attempt on his life. Holmes spent several minutes at his bedside, observing him in silence before rejoining us in the corridor. "Our Mr. Fenwick is more important to this case than we initially supposed," he remarked, as we walked toward the hospital entrance. "Important enough that someone wishes him silenced permanently." "But why?" I wondered. "By his own account, he remembers nothing of value." "Perhaps," said Holmes, "it is not what he remembers that poses a threat, but what he might yet recall." Dawn was breaking as we returned to the inn, a faint lightening of the eastern sky barely visible through the curtain of rain. Holmes declined to retire, instead settling himself by the dying fire in the parlor with his pipe, surrounded by a cloud of blue smoke as he pondered the increasingly complex puzzle before us. I dozed fitfully in an armchair opposite, awakening some hours later to find Holmes still in the same position, though his pipe had gone cold. His grey eyes had a distant, almost feverish quality that I recognized from our past adventures, the look of a man who has glimpsed a solution but hesitates to articulate it, even to himself. "I believe I begin to see the outline of this affair, Watson," he said slowly, noticing that I was awake. "It is a theory so outlandish, so utterly fantastic, that I hesitate to give it voice lest you question my sanity. After all our years together, Holmes, I would trust your judgment implicitly, no matter how extraordinary." He offered a thin smile. "Your faith is touching, my dear fellow. Let us put my theory to the test. We must return to the railway line, but not to examine the track itself. Rather, we must explore what lies beneath it." "Beneath it?" "Yes, Watson, for I believe the explanation for our vanishing train may lie not in the realm of the supernatural, as the popular press would have it, but in the solid earth beneath our feet." He rose, his tall frame casting a long shadow across the faded carpet. "We must secure proper equipment before we proceed, for I suspect our investigation is about to take us into the very bowels of the earth, and perhaps to the heart of one of the most audacious crimes in the annals of British history." As we hastened to prepare for this new phase of our investigation, I could not suppress a shudder of apprehension, for Holmes's expression held a gravity I had rarely witnessed before, the look of a man confronting not merely an ingenious criminal scheme, but something that challenged the very foundations of rational thought itself. Chapter 4. The Underground Connection. The rain had relented somewhat by the time we set out, though the sky remained leaden and threatening, hanging low over the sodden countryside like a shroud. Holmes had been unusually taciturn during our preparations, responding to my queries with monosyllables as he gathered the equipment he deemed necessary for our expedition, ropes, lanterns, a compass, and a curious brass instrument I did not recognize. Inspector Lestrade had received our proposal with evident skepticism. An abandoned coal mine, Mr. Holmes? What possible connection could there be between a disused pit and a vanishing train? That, my dear Lestrade, is precisely what we intend to discover. Holmes had replied enigmatically. We found ourselves an hour later at the entrance to what had once been the Thornbridge Colliery, a sprawling complex of abandoned mine workings that had ceased operations some 15 years previously. Nature had begun to reclaim the site, ivy and brambles threading their way through the rusted remains of machinery, while the entrance to the main shaft stood like a gaping wound in the hillside, exhaling a chill, damp breath redolent of earth and decay. According to the geological survey maps I consulted this morning, Holmes explained as we prepared to enter, the main shaft extends for nearly 2 miles beneath the surrounding countryside, with numerous galleries and lateral tunnels branching off at various depths. Most significantly, one such branch passes directly beneath the railway line at the precise point where our train vanished. You believe there is a connection between the mine and the disappearance? Lestrade asked, his ferret-like features creased with doubt. I believe it is a possibility we must explore, Holmes replied, lighting his lantern. The sediment I found on Fenwick's trousers contains traces of coal dust and a particular type of clay found only at considerable depth in this region. The descent into the mine was an arduous affair. The main shaft had been partially collapsed in places, requiring us to navigate around fallen timbers and accumulations of rubble. The air grew increasingly close and damp as we progressed, our lanterns casting grotesque, dancing shadows upon the rough-hewn walls. The sound of water dripping somewhere in the darkness formed a melancholy counterpoint to our labored breathing, and the occasional fall of loose stones beneath our feet. Observe the footprints, gentlemen, Holmes remarked suddenly, holding his lantern close to the ground. This tunnel has seen recent traffic. Indeed, the muddy floor bore numerous impressions of booted feet, overlapping and of varying ages, but some undeniably fresh. Perhaps local youth seeking adventure, Lestrade suggested without conviction. Perhaps, Holmes conceded, though one would expect such visitors to confine themselves to the upper levels. These tracks lead deeper. We continued our descent, the tunnel gradually widening into a substantial gallery from which several smaller passages branched. Holmes consulted his compass and a folded map he produced from his pocket. This way, he directed, indicating a tunnel that bore to the right. This passage should lead us beneath the railway line. The tunnel in question showed signs of recent activity more pronounced than those we had observed previously. The supporting timbers appeared to have been replaced or reinforced, and the debris that littered the floor of other passages had been cleared away. Most tellingly, a set of narrow-gauge rails had been installed along the floor, disappearing into the darkness ahead. This is no work of casual trespassers, Holmes observed softly. These are the marks of deliberate and extensive operations. Our way was suddenly illuminated by a harsh electric glare from somewhere ahead. We extinguished our lanterns immediately and proceeded with greater caution, the sound of voices now faintly audible over the distant drip of water. The tunnel terminated in a vast cavernous space that had been hollowed out of the living rock. Here the evidence of recent activity was unmistakable. The chamber was illuminated by electric arc lamps suspended from the ceiling, their harsh light revealing a scene of extraordinary industry. The walls had been reinforced with iron struts and concrete, while the ceiling, directly beneath the railway line, according to Holmes's calculations, had been fitted with an elaborate system of hydraulic presses and metal plates. Most remarkable of all, however, was the collection of machinery that occupied the center of the chamber. Strange devices of brass and steel, their purpose obscure but their sophistication evident, surrounded what appeared to be the disassembled components of a railway locomotive. Not, Holmes noted in a whisper, the missing express, but an older model. What in heaven's name is all this, Holmes? I breathed, utterly confounded by the sight before us. "I believe, Watson, that we are looking at the means by which a train might be made to vanish," he replied, "though the precise mechanism remains to be determined." Our examination was cut short by the sudden appearance of two men entering the chamber from a tunnel on the far side. They were rough-looking fellows attired in the manner of laborers, but carrying incongruously military-pattern rifles. Holmes gestured for us to retreat into the shadow of a large piece of machinery, but our movement was detected. "Who's there?" called one of the men, raising his rifle. "Show yourselves." In the confusion that followed, several shots were fired, the reports deafening in the enclosed space. Holmes, with remarkable presence of mind, seized a heavy wrench from a nearby workbench and hurled it at the nearest arc lamp, plunging a portion of the chamber into darkness. He commanded, and we needed no second bidding. Our retreat was hasty and disordered, our pursuers' footsteps echoing behind us as we navigated the darkened tunnels by the fitful light of a single lantern that Lestrade had managed to reignite. At a junction of 3 passages, Holmes made a swift decision. "Separate," he instructed. "Lestrade, take the left passage with Watson. I shall take the right. We shall reconvene at the inn if possible." Before I could protest this arrangement, Holmes had disappeared into the rightmost tunnel, his footsteps receding rapidly. Lestrade and I had no choice but to follow his instruction, plunging into the leftmost passage as the sounds of pursuit grew closer. Our flight through the darkness of the mine was a nightmare journey. I shall not soon forget. Twice we were forced to extinguish our lantern as our pursuers drew near, proceeding by touch alone through sections of tunnel where the darkness was absolute. Once we concealed ourselves in a small side chamber as several men passed by, their lanterns throwing long shadows and their voices echoing harshly in the confined space. "Must find them," one was saying. "If they've seen the mechanism, the boss won't be pleased," replied another. "First that banker escapes, now this." Eventually, after what seemed an eternity but was perhaps no more than an hour, we emerged into the blessed daylight, some distance from where we had entered. The afternoon was well advanced, the sky clearing to reveal patches of blue between scudding clouds. Of Holmes there was no sign. We made our way back to the inn, where we waited in increasing anxiety as the hours passed with no word from my friend. Lestrade dispatched constables to search the vicinity of the mine entrance, but they returned at dusk with no news. "I fear Holmes may have been captured, or worse," I confided to Lestrade, as we sat before the fire in the inn's private parlour, the untouched remnants of our dinner pushed aside. "Holmes has extricated himself from tighter spots before," the inspector replied, though his tone lacked conviction. "We must have faith in his resourcefulness." Another hour passed in tense silence. Then, just as I was preparing to organize a more comprehensive search, there came a sharp knock at the inn's door. The landlord appeared moments later, bearing a telegram addressed to me. With fingers that trembled slightly, I tore open the envelope and read the brief message within. It was indeed from Holmes, though its contents did little to allay my concerns. "Observe midnight train to Bristol. The vanishing shall repeat itself." What can he mean? Lestrade wondered, reading the telegram over my shoulder. Surely he doesn't suggest that the same fate awaits tonight's midnight express as befell the 8:15. I finished his thought. "I believe that is precisely what he is suggesting, Inspector, and furthermore that we must be aboard it if we are to unravel this mystery." As we hastily prepared for this potentially perilous journey, I could not suppress a shudder of apprehension, for if Holmes was correct, we were deliberately placing ourselves in the path of whatever force or agency had caused an entire train to vanish without trace. Yet I knew that Holmes would not have directed us to this course without good reason, and perhaps he himself would be present, though in what capacity I could not begin to guess. The station clock showed 11:30 when Lestrade and I took our places aboard the midnight express to Bristol. The platform was sparsely populated at that late hour, a handful of travellers boarding with the weary resignation of those accustomed to nocturnal journeys. Of Holmes there was still no sign, though I scrutinized each face, in the hope of discovering my friend in one of his many effective disguises. "What do you suppose will happen?" Lestrade murmured as the guard's whistle shrilled, and the train began to move ponderously out of the station. "I cannot say," I replied honestly, "but whatever occurs, we must be vigilant. Holmes clearly believes that tonight we shall witness the mechanism by which a train can be made to disappear, and perhaps discover the fate of those 47 souls who vanished with the 8:15 express." As the train gathered speed and the lights of the station fell away behind us, I felt a curious mingling of dread and anticipation, for we were now embarked upon the strangest and most perilous phase of our investigation, a journey into the very heart of the mystery, with only Holmes's cryptic message to guide us through the dangers that surely lay ahead. Chapter 5: The Midnight Watch. The midnight express to Bristol was sparsely occupied, allowing Lestrade and myself to secure a private compartment without difficulty. Following Holmes's cryptic instructions, we had concealed ourselves as best we could, Lestrade exchanging his customary bowler for a flat cap, more befitting a commercial traveller, while I had donned a pair of tinted spectacles and a false moustache from the theatrical kit. Holmes insisted I carry on our adventures. Outside the window, the countryside was a study in monochrome, the moon occasionally breaking through tattered clouds to illuminate isolated farmhouses and sleeping villages. The rhythmic clacking of wheels upon rail ordinarily might have induced a soporific effect, but our nerves were strung to such a pitch of anticipation that sleep was an impossibility. "We are approaching the section of track where the first train vanished," Lestrade noted, consulting his pocket watch in the dim light of our compartment's gas lamp. "Another 3 minutes by my reckoning," I nodded, peering intently through the window, though what I expected to see in the nocturnal landscape I could not have articulated. The carriage swayed gently as we rounded a gradual curve, the moonlight briefly illuminating the telegraph poles that marched alongside the track, their wires etched against the night sky like a musical stave. "Do you feel that?" I asked suddenly, gripping the edge of my seat. "Feel what?" Lestrade began, but then his expression changed. "By Jove, yes." A vibration different from the usual motion of the train. Indeed, a subtle but unmistakable tremor had begun to communicate itself through the structure of the carriage, distinct from the familiar rhythms of rail travel. It was accompanied by a curious change in the quality of sound, as though the clatter of wheels had become somehow muffled or distant. On an impulse, I lowered the window glass and thrust my head out into the rushing night air. What I observed caused me to withdraw hastily and seize Lestrade's arm. "Look!" I exclaimed. "The landscape, it's changing." The inspector joined me at the window, and together we beheld an extraordinary phenomenon. The familiar contours of the railway cutting seemed to be undergoing a subtle transformation, the steep embankments appearing to flatten and then rise again in a configuration distinctly different from what had existed moments before. Most remarkably, none of our fellow passengers visible in adjacent carriages showed any sign of noticing this bizarre alteration. "The train is slowing," Lestrade observed, his voice hushed with amazement. "Yet there is no sign of a station, nor has the guard announced a stop." He was correct. Our speed had diminished appreciably, though without the usual accompaniment of brakes being applied. For perhaps 30 seconds we seemed to be proceeding at a walking pace. Then, as suddenly as these anomalies had manifested, they ceased. The familiar rhythm of the journey resumed, the landscape beyond the window regained its expected appearance, and the train's speed returned to normal. "What in heaven's name was that?" Lestrade breathed, his normally composed features betraying profound bewilderment. "I believe," I replied slowly, "that we have just experienced whatever befell the 8:15 express, though in our case the process was apparently reversed before completion." We proceeded to the next station, a small rural halt, illuminated by a single gas lamp, and disembarked with alacrity, much to the bemusement of the solitary porter on duty. As the train pulled away into the darkness, continuing its journey to Bristol, Lestrade commandeered a trap from the nearby village inn, and we set off back along the railway line toward the section where we had experienced the strange phenomena. The night had grown chill, a light frost silvering the grass beside the railway cutting as we made our way along the maintenance path that paralleled the track. We had proceeded thus for perhaps a mile when we discovered a canvas-wrapped bundle concealed in the hollow of an ancient oak that stood sentinel beside the path. Within the canvas, we found the equipment Holmes had arranged to be delivered: a pair of powerful electric torches, a coil of sturdy rope, a set of iron pitons, and most curiously, a device resembling a mining engineer's theodolite, though modified in ways I did not comprehend. But how are we to use these implements? Lestrade wondered aloud. And where is Holmes himself? As if in answer to his question, a low whistle sounded from the darkness ahead. Advancing cautiously, our torch beams probing the shadows, we discovered a narrow footpath descending the railway embankment to a point where an ancient stone culvert passed beneath the track. The entrance to this drain was considerably larger than functional necessity would dictate, and showed signs of recent enlargement. "This way, gentlemen," came a familiar voice from within the culvert, and a moment later, Holmes himself emerged, his tall figure stooping to clear the low ceiling. His clothing was muddied and torn, his usually immaculate appearance compromised by what had evidently been a strenuous and hazardous day, but his grey eyes were alight with the exhilaration of the chase. "Holmes!" I exclaimed. "We feared you had been captured, or worse." "A narrow escape, Watson," he acknowledged, "but one that afforded me the opportunity to conduct a most enlightening reconnaissance. Come, there is not a moment to lose. What I have discovered exceeds even my most extravagant hypotheses." With Holmes leading the way, we entered the culvert, which proved to extend far beyond its apparent purpose of channeling a now dry streambed beneath the railway. After some 50 yards, the passage widened into a roughly hewn tunnel, its walls supported by timber props of recent installation. The floor of this tunnel was laid with narrow-gauge rails similar to those we had observed in the mine, though these appeared better maintained and showed signs of frequent use. "You were correct about an underground connection," Lestrade admitted as we proceeded along this passage. "But I confess I still cannot conceive how an entire train might vanish, even with such a tunnel system beneath the track." "The tunnel itself is merely the access point," Holmes explained. "The mechanism of the train's disappearance is considerably more ingenious and more audacious than a simple diversion into a hidden passage." The tunnel terminated at what appeared to be a dead end, but Holmes, shining his torch along the wall, located a concealed lever which, when activated, caused a section of the seemingly solid rock face to pivot, revealing a passage beyond. This new tunnel was larger and more sophisticated in its construction, with electric lighting strung along its ceiling and rails of standard gauge upon its floor. "We are now," Holmes informed us in a low voice, "within the hidden infrastructure constructed by our adversaries. From this point onward, we must proceed with the utmost caution. The operators of this facility may still be present, though I believe most will have departed, following the passage of the midnight express." Our path now led upward at a gentle incline, eventually opening into a cavernous space so vast that our torch beams could not illuminate its furthest reaches. As we advanced, the nature of this chamber became apparent. It was a massive underground depot, carved from the living rock and extended by human artifice, its ceiling supported by massive iron columns, and its floor occupied by an intricate network of railway tracks. And there, in the center of this subterranean terminus, stood the 8:15 express from Paddington to Bristol, intact, but eerily silent and empty. "Good God," breathed Lestrade, his voice echoing in the vast space. "It's actually here. But where are the passengers?" "That," replied Holmes grimly, "is the question that has occupied my thoughts since I first conceived of this audacious scheme. Come, let us examine the carriages. But be vigilant. We are almost certainly not alone here." The train stood as though ready for departure, its locomotive cold but otherwise intact. We moved cautiously along the length of the train, examining each carriage in turn. They were immaculate, showing no signs of a struggle or hasty evacuation. Personal belongings remained in the luggage racks, a newspaper lay folded on a seat, and a lady's glove had fallen to the floor of a first-class compartment. It was as though the passengers had simply evaporated, leaving no trace of their existence save these mute possessions. "Most curious," Holmes murmured, examining the carriage where, according to the seating plan we had obtained from the railway company, Lord Blackwood should have been travelling. "Observe these marks upon the upholstery, Watson. And here, upon the floor, scuff marks inconsistent with ordinary boarding or alighting." "This signs of a struggle?" I suggested. "Indeed, and observe this." He indicated a small dark stain upon the carpet. "If I am not mistaken, that is blood, though a very small quantity. Most interesting, in the guard's van at the rear of the train, we found further evidence of unusual activity. The mail bags had been rifled, their contents strewn across the floor, and the guard's logbook lay open, its final entry uncompleted, a single word trailing off into an illegible scrawl. It was in this same compartment that Holmes made his most significant discovery, a leather portfolio bearing the seal of the Foreign Office, concealed beneath a loose floorboard. Within were several sheets of paper covered in what appeared to be technical drawings, though of a nature so specialized that I could make little sense of them. "Lord Blackwood's diplomatic papers?" Lestrade inquired. "Some of them, perhaps," Holmes replied, carefully returning the documents to the portfolio, "but not, I think, the true objective of this extraordinary operation. No, Inspector, I believe what we are witnessing is a far more complex affair than the mere theft of diplomatic dispatches." Our attention was drawn by a sudden sound from the far end of the underground depot, the unmistakable noise of a heavy door being opened. Holmes immediately extinguished his torch, gesturing for us to do likewise. "We must withdraw," he whispered urgently. "There is more to discover, but not at the risk of capture." Guided by Holmes, who seemed to have committed the layout of the facility to memory during his earlier reconnaissance, we retreated to a small side chamber containing what appeared to be electrical switching equipment. From here, Holmes produced a folded document from his pocket, a map, hand-drawn but remarkably detailed, marking not only the underground facility, but also its connections to the world above. "I discovered this in the facility's control room," he explained in hushed tones. "It appears our adversaries have established a network far more extensive than we initially supposed. And here," he indicated a location marked with a red cross, "is our next destination, a remote estate near the coast, some 30 miles from here." "The coastal estate?" I inquired. "But how are we to reach it?" "There is a system of underground railways connecting these installations," Holmes replied. "But in this instance I believe a more conventional approach may serve us better. We shall return to the surface and procure transportation by ordinary means." As we prepared to depart, a final search of the guard's van yielded one more critical piece of evidence, a printed manifest listing the passengers of the 8:15 express, with certain names underlined in red ink. Among these marked individuals was not only Lord Blackwood, but also one Professor Alistair Fleming, a name that caused Holmes's eyebrows to rise significantly. "Fleming?" he murmured. "Of course, now the pattern becomes clear." "You know this name?" Lestrade inquired. "Professor Alistair Fleming is one of Britain's foremost naval engineers," Holmes explained. "His recent work on submersible vessels has been the subject of considerable interest, not all of it benign. If he was aboard that train, and his presence was known to our adversaries, he left the implication hanging ominously. Our retreat from the underground facility was accomplished without incident, emerging once more through the culvert into the chill night air. The stars were beginning to fade as dawn approached, the eastern sky lightening to a pale, luminous grey. "To the coastal estate, then?" Lestrade asked as we regained the trap we had left tethered near the railway embankment. "With all possible haste," Holmes confirmed. for I fear that what began as a puzzle of abstract intellectual interest has become a matter of the gravest national importance, and the lives of 47 innocent souls, not to mention the naval supremacy of Great Britain, may depend upon our reaching that estate before the transaction is completed. As our conveyance rattled through the awakening countryside, I found myself reflecting upon the extraordinary revelations of the night. A train that vanished, only to reappear intact in a vast underground chamber, passengers who had seemingly evaporated into thin air, and behind it all, a scheme of such audacity and complexity that even Holmes, with all his experience of criminal ingenuity, had been moved to admiration even as he sought to unravel it. What awaited us at the coastal estate, I could not begin to imagine. But of one thing I was certain: we were approaching the final act in a drama of unprecedented scale and significance. And as the first rays of the sun gilded the horizon, I offered a silent prayer that we would not arrive too late. Chapter 6. The Secret Harbour. The journey to the coastal estate consumed the better part of the morning, our progress hampered by winding country lanes rendered treacherous by recent rains. Holmes sat in uncharacteristic silence for much of the journey, his keen eyes scanning the landscape as though committing every detail to memory, his fingers absently drumming a restless tattoo upon his knee. As we approached the coast, the character of the countryside underwent a subtle transformation. The gentle, cultivated farmland gave way to a wilder, more desolate terrain, wind-swept downs that sloped precipitously toward a slate-grey sea visible in the distance. Gulls wheeled overhead, their mournful cries carried on a salt-laden breeze that bent the sparse vegetation into permanent attitudes of supplication. The estate should lie just beyond that headland, Holmes announced, breaking his long silence. Blackthorn Manor, purchased some 3 years ago by a consortium of investors fronted by Sir Malcolm Hargrove. The industrialist, Lestrade inquired with evident surprise. I had understood him to be one of Lord Blackwood's most vociferous political opponents. Precisely, Holmes replied, a thin smile playing about his lips, a fact which initially directed my suspicions toward him as the architect of this affair. But as is so often the case, Inspector, the truth has proven considerably more complex. A sharp turn in the road brought us within sight of our destination, a sprawling Victorian edifice of dark stone, perched upon the cliff edge like some brooding sentinel. Its Gothic towers and crenellated battlements presented an imposing silhouette against the leaden sky, while the grounds surrounding it appeared unnaturally devoid of activity. For an estate of such magnitude, we abandoned our conveyance in a copse of stunted pines some half-mile distant, approaching the estate on foot, through a stretch of rough terrain that afforded some measure of concealment. As we drew nearer, the true nature of the property became apparent. What had appeared from a distance to be an architectural folly in the Gothic Revival style was, in fact, a formidably defensible position. The windows of the main building were narrow, and few. The approaches to the main entrance commanded by elevated terraces that would provide excellent fields of fire, and discreet observation points had been established at strategic locations throughout the grounds. "This is no gentleman's country residence," Holmes murmured as we paused behind a low stone wall that marked the estate's boundary. "It is a fortress, designed for security rather than comfort." Our surveillance revealed the presence of numerous guards patrolling the perimeter, men with the bearing and vigilance of military veterans rather than ordinary estate workers. They carried themselves with the alert posture of those accustomed to danger, and I observed with disquiet that each man appeared to be armed beneath his civilian attire. "How are we to penetrate such defenses?" I whispered to Holmes. His response was to produce from his pocket a small brass whistle, upon which he sounded a series of notes in a specific pattern. Almost immediately, an answering series came from somewhere to our right, and a moment later, a figure emerged from the concealment of a nearby thicket. To my astonishment, it was a man dressed in the uniform of the estate's guards, though his bearing was familiar, and as he drew closer, I recognized with a shock the aquiline features of Sherlock Holmes beneath the cap pulled low over his brow. "Holmes!" I exclaimed. "But how?" "A simple matter of disguise, Watson," replied the newcomer with the unmistakable voice of my friend. I anticipated that we might require access to this facility, and took the precaution of arranging it in advance. I looked from the Holmes beside me to the Holmes in guard's uniform with utter bewilderment. Then, with a chuckle, the Holmes who had accompanied us on our journey removed his hat and peeled away what proved to be a remarkably convincing false beard, revealing the features of a much younger man. "May I introduce Mr. Stanley Hopkins of Scotland Yard," said the Holmes in guard's uniform, one of Lestrade's most promising young inspectors and a talented amateur of the theatrical arts. I took the liberty of employing his services when it became apparent that I would need to infiltrate this establishment while simultaneously directing your movements. "You've been here all along?" Lestrade asked, his tone suggesting a mixture of admiration and irritation at having been so thoroughly deceived. "Since yesterday afternoon," Holmes confirmed. "Following our separation in the mine, I was able to follow one of the fleeing guards to this location. Gaining entry was a simple matter of incapacitating a solitary sentry and assuming his identity." "And what have you discovered?" I inquired eagerly. Holmes beckoned us to follow him through a carefully concealed gap in the estate's perimeter defenses. "The truth, my dear Watson, a truth more extraordinary than even I had anticipated. This estate is merely the visible portion of a far more extensive facility. Beneath us lies a hidden harbor, carved into the cliff face and accessible only via a system of concealed elevators within the main building. It is there that we shall find the missing passengers and the true objective of this elaborate scheme. With Holmes as our guide, we were able to circumvent the estate's outer security and gain access to a service entrance at the rear of the main building. The interior was a curious blend of faded Victorian opulence and modern, utilitarian modifications. Electric lighting had been installed alongside the original gas fixtures, and what had once been elegant reception rooms had been converted into functional workspaces filled with technical equipment, whose purpose I could not discern. Most of the staff have been transferred to the harbor level, Holmes explained as he led us through a labyrinth of corridors. "The final preparations for departure are underway." "Departure?" Lestrade echoed. "Of whom?" "Of our antagonists and their prize," Holmes replied grimly. "For what we face, gentlemen, is not merely a criminal enterprise but a meticulously orchestrated act of international espionage." We descended via a hidden elevator, concealed behind what appeared to be a solid wall in the estate's wine cellar. The mechanism operated with surprising smoothness, conveying us swiftly downward into the living rock of the cliff. When the doors opened, we found ourselves in a vast, cathedral-like cavern hewn from the limestone, a secret harbor connected to the open sea by a narrow channel invisible from the coastline above. And there, floating upon the dark waters of this hidden basin, was a vessel unlike any I had previously encountered, a sleek, cigar-shaped craft of riveted steel, with only a small conning tower and deck visible above the waterline. It was, I realized with a shock, a submarine vessel of advanced design, its hull bearing no identifying marks or national insignia. "My God," breathed Lestrade. "Is that a submersible warship?" Holmes confirmed, incorporating advanced features that exist only in theoretical form in the British Admiralty's design bureaus. Or rather, they existed thus until Professor Fleming's recent breakthroughs which our adversaries were evidently aware of and determined to acquire. Activity around the submarine was intense, with numerous figures moving purposefully between the vessel and a series of warehouses built into the cavern walls. From our concealed position on an elevated gantry, we could observe the loading of equipment and supplies, supervised by a tall, distinguished man whose bearing suggested authority. "Sir Malcolm Hargrove," Holmes identified him. "But he is merely a secondary player in this drama," observed the man now emerging from the conning tower. I followed his gesture and felt a jolt of recognition. "Mr. Harrington, the railway official who brought us the case. Indeed, Watson, or rather Colonel Wilhelm Schaefer of German Imperial Intelligence, a man whose skill at adopting English identities has served his masters in Berlin most effectively over the past decade. But what is their purpose? I asked, struggling to comprehend the scale of the deception. Surely not merely to steal this submarine design, not to steal it, Watson, to auction it, Holmes replied. What we are witnessing is the culmination of an operation years in the planning. The abduction of Fleming and the acquisition of his designs was merely the first phase. Now representatives of several foreign powers have gathered to bid for both the submarine prototype and its creator. The passengers from the train are being held in those warehouses to be released or disposed of, depending on the outcome of this auction. We must act immediately, Lestrade declared, reaching for his police whistle. Holmes stayed his hand. Patience, Inspector. We are outnumbered and outgunned, but assistance is already at hand. As if in response to his words, a sudden commotion erupted at the harbour entrance. The narrow channel connecting the hidden basin to the sea was abruptly illuminated by powerful searchlights, and into the harbour glided the sleek form of a British torpedo boat, its deck bristling with naval personnel armed with rifles. I took the liberty, Holmes explained with evident satisfaction, of communicating our discoveries to certain contacts at the Admiralty before departing the underground facility. The Royal Navy has maintained a discreet watch on this coastline since early this morning. What followed was a scene of controlled chaos. The naval forces, joined by a contingent of Marines who rappelled dramatically from the cavern ceiling where they had been positioned in advance, swiftly established control of the harbour. Most of the conspirators surrendered without resistance when confronted with such overwhelming force, though Hargrove and several others attempted to reach the submarine, only to be intercepted before they could cast off. Colonel Schaefer, alias Harrington, proved more resourceful. Evading the initial sweep, he managed to activate the submarine's engines and begin maneuvering the vessel toward the harbour entrance, despite being its sole operator. It was Holmes himself who prevented his escape, executing a flying leap from the gantry onto the submarine's deck as it passed beneath, and engaging Schaefer in a desperate struggle atop the conning tower. I watched in helpless horror as the two men grappled at the very edge of the narrow deck, the submarine now dangerously close to the harbour entrance. Then, with a final decisive movement, Holmes threw his adversary off balance. Schaefer toppled into the dark waters, while Holmes managed to access the conning tower and bring the vessel under control, guiding it back to the harbour, where waiting naval personnel took charge. The aftermath of the confrontation revealed the full extent of the conspiracy. The passengers from the train were indeed being held in the warehouses, most in a state of drug-induced unconsciousness that explained their failure to resist abduction. Professor Fleming was found in a separate facility, under heavier guard but otherwise unharmed, his revolutionary designs intact and now secured by the Admiralty representatives. It appears, Holmes explained to us later, as we watched the naval personnel coordinating the evacuation of the rescued passengers, that our adventure began as a result of chance. Fleming had been travelling incognito on the Bristol train, his presence known only to the highest levels of the Admiralty. Somehow, Schaefer's organization discovered this fact and implemented their audacious plan to acquire both the man and his designs. But how was the train itself made to vanish? I asked, still struggling to comprehend the mechanics of the feat. Through a brilliant application of engineering principles, Holmes replied. The section of track above the abandoned mine had been modified with a hydraulic mechanism capable of temporarily lowering the entire railbed, track and all, into a waiting tunnel beneath. The train would roll onto this section, be swiftly lowered into the underground facility, and then the track would be raised again, leaving no visible evidence of the diversion. The telegraph wires had been modified to disguise the interruption in service during the critical moments of the operation. And the passengers, rendered unconscious by a fast-acting sedative gas introduced through the ventilation system, then transferred to carriages for transportation to this facility. Fenwick managed to escape during the transfer, hence his confused state and the unusual location of his discovery. The markings on his hands were electrical burns, sustained when he attempted to use the telegraph equipment in the guard's van to call for help. As Holmes elaborated upon the technical details of the scheme, I could not help but marvel at the ingenuity it represented, even as I condemned its sinister purpose. The combination of the abandoned mine, the hydraulic mechanism, and the secret harbor constituted an operation of unprecedented scope and ambition. The return journey to London was undertaken in the comparative luxury of a naval vessel, escorted by the torpedo boat that had so decisively intervened in the affair. Holmes, having provided a comprehensive briefing to the Admiralty representatives who had taken charge of the situation, lapsed into a contemplative silence, broken only by occasional observations on the technical aspects of the case that had particularly impressed him. "There is a certain elegance to it, Watson," he remarked as we stood at the rail watching the coastline recede behind us. "One almost regrets that such ingenuity was directed toward criminal ends. Yet you unraveled it," I observed with some pride in my friend's achievement. Holmes smiled faintly. The critical insight came when I observed the unusual wear patterns on the railway track. Only a mechanism capable of moving the entire track could explain both those markings and the complete absence of any sign that the train had left the rails. Once that possibility was admitted, the rest followed as a logical necessity. Several days later, we received a visit at Baker Street from a senior Admiralty official who conveyed the government's profound gratitude for Holmes's role in the affair. The conspiracy had been completely dismantled, Fleming's designs secured for the Royal Navy's exclusive use, and the passengers from the train had all recovered from their ordeal, with no lasting ill effects, their temporary amnesia a blessing that spared them the worst memories of their captivity. "There is one aspect of the case that continues to puzzle me, Holmes," I remarked after our visitor had departed. "How did you first suspect Harrington's true identity?" Holmes tamped fresh tobacco into his pipe before replying. "It was his shoes, Watson. Harrington's shoes were of continental manufacture, specifically German, though in all other respects his appearance was impeccably English. A small detail, perhaps, but in my experience, it is precisely such small inconsistencies that betray the most carefully constructed deceptions." He struck a match and applied it thoughtfully to his pipe, sending wreaths of blue smoke toward the ceiling. "The case will never become public knowledge, of course. The official explanation will attribute the train's disappearance to a signal failure that diverted it onto a disused branch line, with the delay in locating it due to administrative error. A mundane explanation for an extraordinary affair," I observed. "As it must be, Watson, the public is not yet prepared to confront the reality of international espionage on British soil, nor the existence of submarine technology that may one day transform the nature of naval warfare." He gazed contemplatively into the fire. "But you may, if you wish, record the adventure for your private files, though I suggest The Vanishing Train of Paddington as a title. It has a certain melodramatic quality that your readers would appreciate, should the account ever be deemed suitable for publication in some distant future." And so I have done, setting down this record of one of the most remarkable cases in Sherlock Holmes's distinguished career, a case that combined his unparalleled deductive powers with matters of the highest national security, and that demonstrated once again that beneath the most apparently supernatural of mysteries often lies a rational explanation, if one has but the wit to perceive it and the courage to pursue it to its conclusion.